Good day, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Before we go any further into our presentation today, remember to keep your microphones muted. During the question and answer session, you will have a chance to share, but until then, keep your microphones muted. Today, we welcome back Sabir Nahkuda, a Muslim author, researcher, and social commentator, to continue his series on the Muslims of CARICOM. Sabir was born in Gujarat, India, and migrated to Barbados when he was 10 years old, he along with his family. In part one of his presentation, if you remember, which is now available on our YouTube channel, Sabir spoke on the arrival of the Islam in Africa, its impact on that continent, the transatlantic voyages of Africans to the Americas. Today we welcome back Sabir Nahkuda. And if you remember in part one of his presentation, he spoke on the arrival of Islam in Africa, its impact on that continent, the transatlantic voyages by Africans to the Americas, Muslims' presence among the enslaved Africans who were brought to this region during the transatlantic slave trade, and also their involvement in the fight against the slave trade, as well as their efforts to preserve their culture, religion, and language under hostile conditions. Today, in his second talk, Sabir will focus on the arrival of Muslims among the indentured laborers from India. If you remember, after the end of apprenticeship, a series of indentured servants came from India to the Caribbean to provide labor. The challenges they faced and how they overcame these challenges and preserved their culture and religion. Sabir?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Harriet. Let me once again thank the Barbados Museum and the Genealogy Group for inviting me again to make my second presentation. As Harriet said, that the first presentation had to do with the arrivals of the Africans to the Caribbean. Not only they were brought as slaves, but they came as explorers. So let me briefly recall or recap what I said. The religion of Islam came to Africa when Prophet Muhammad in Mecca started to preach the oneness of God to his people. They didn't like that because they were pagan, worshiping many gods. And so they were prosecuted, they were persecuted. So he sent some of his followers to Ethiopia as refugees. So Islam came around the early 7th century to Africa, and the Muslims came as refugees. And over a period of time, then merchants from that Muslims started to come later. They came through trade, they came through preachers coming there, and sometimes also through conquest too. Then merchants from North Africa and the Middle East started to establish centers in West Africa, and some of these centers became large cities such as Jenny and Timbuktu. Literacy flourished in West Africa with the coming of Islam and coming of the merchants and the traders from North Africa and the Middle East. And the Songhai Empire was known for the Islamic University of Sankori, based in Timbuktu. Many African scholars and others from the Muslim world came to this 14th century university. They come to study the work of Plato and Aristotle. They come to study the law, philosophy, astronomy, and other sciences. In West Africa, a large percentage of Muslims were literate in Arabic and adopted many of the Arabic letters into their own languages. They were very keen on reading the Quran, and many of them memorized the Quran. So they knew the Quran in Arabic. They memorized it. So the Quranic schools were open all over Africa. Muslim adults and also non-Muslims could participate in these Quranic schools. Parents took their children also to these schools too. Uh, there where they were uh, taught Islamic knowledge and so on. Many of these Islamic scholars, which are known as the Marabouts, when the slavery started, the Atlantic slave trade started, many of the Marabouts, the Islamic scholars, were also those who were captured in the Atlantic slave trade. It was these same Marabouts, the Islamic scholars, who were at the forefront of fighting against slavery, and they provided guidance and made protective amulets called gris. So later on, you will see that Arabic played a very important role in fighting against the inhumane slave system in the West. About 200 years prior to the invasion by the Christopher Columbus, West African Muslims were undertaking transatlantic voyages with massive fleets of ships. Mansa Musa's brother, Mansa Abu Bakri Musa, in 1312, left the Senegambia coast in 1312 with 2,000 ships uh, and set sail to discover the limits of the Atlantic, heading west across the Atlantic Ocean, never to return. Some of these ships also landed in St. Vincent. And so today you have the Black Caribs and the Black Caribs because the West African Muslims intermarried with the Caribs and the Arawaks, and that is how we have in St. Vincent Black Caribs, or they are also known as the Garinago people, and they practice the Garifuna culture and so on. Thor Heyerdahl, uh, a, 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 a Norwegian explorer in 1970, July 12, 1970, wanted to prove that Africans were sailing long time before Columbus, and they were trading with the Arawaks and the Taino Indians and the Caribs and so on. And so he made a papyrus raft. He set sail from Safi in Morocco on the 12th of July, 1970. It took him about 52 days to get to Barbados, but he wanted to prove that Africans were sailing to the New World long time before Columbus. I was very happy, and I am very happy that the Barbados Museum did commemorate that 50th anniversary on the 12th of July, and it happened to be Sunday too, 2020 by the careenage. The Ra-2 voyage from Morocco to Barbados. And I think that Barbados Museum and Suleiman Bulbulia are to be thanked for that particular effort to highlight the visit of Ra-2 50 years ago. You know, slavery existed in Africa too. And so in many African societies, the enslaved were not treated as chattel slaves as we know today, but were considered as human beings with many privileges, even becoming military leaders and rulers. Walter Rodney stated in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, that he said, at least up to the 17th century in Upper Guinea, there were no such institution as slavery. It is also known that in Calabar, which is southern Nigeria, as late as the 19th century, that there were no special word for the European term slave and master. The word used as the equivalent were child and father. Between 1500 and 1866, approximately 15 million Africans were shipped to the Americas and the Caribbean. Over 20% of them perished during the long and turbulent Atlantic voyage. Vast majority of the slaves came from Western and Central Africa. Among them were a significant percentage of Muslims. These Muslims came from areas where Islam was present during the slave trade, such as Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Mali, Benin, Ghana, and Nigeria. Among the Muslim tribes who were enslaved were the Mandingos, the Mandays, the Mandinkas, the Fulani, the Hausa, the Nago, Mina, and Wolofs. These were some of the Muslim tribes that were captured and brought to the West. And of course, the main purpose of the slave trade was to obtain laborers for the sugar, tobacco, and the cotton plantation that the Europeans were starting to develop in their various colonies in the West. The indigenous Indians like the Tainos had been wiped out by the diseases and by genocides too. So they turned to Africa for cheap labor in the form of slaves. The significance of the African slave trade was that it disrupted the life of the entire continent and uprooted millions of people. It destroyed cultural way of life. That cultural way of life was superior to many of the cultural way of life in Europe. This slave trade took the youngest, the strongest, the scholars. It didn't spare anyone. It took the scholars, the ruling class, and all those who were most capable of bringing the greatest benefit to Africa. Of course, Africans resisted the slave trade, even from Africa before they even boarded the slave ship. And that resistance continued even when they landed on the plantation in the form of maroonage. So there were many maroon uprisings. They fled the plantation and they formed their own colonies called the Maroon colonies. And many of the Muslims were the leaders of the Maroon colonies. And some of the greatest Maroons that we know would be Macandal in Haiti and Boukman in Haiti. And these two Muslims, Marabout, Islamic scholars, were the ones who instigated the revolution in Haiti, so that Macandal in 1751 began his revolution from 1751 to 1757. And then Boukman took over, Dutty Boukman, and then he lit the flame again in 1791. And of course, Toussaint Louverture then continued that revolution. And we know that Haiti then got its independence on the 1st of January, 1804. That was the most successful slave revolution that we know about. And of course, that revolution also created uproar, and there were other revolts and revolutions throughout the Western, in the Caribbean and so on. So we had also revolts and revolution in Barbados, and we had other parts of the Caribbean too. You know about the Bassa Revolution in 1816. Eventually, that same revolt, that Haitian Revolution, and the success of that Haitian Revolution also led to the end of the slavery in 1834. After the end of slavery in 1834, uh, the Africans didn't want to work in the plantations. Uh, they wanted to have many of them became artisans and traders and stevedores. So that led to a shortage of labor on the sugar plantation of the British, the Dutch, and the French. So that sugar that shortage also uh, caused the plantation owners to establish a system or a contract labor system called indentureship. So the planters started to initially bring people from southern USA, and they brought people from Madeira and Malta, China, but the conditions were very, very hard. And the system was very, very similar to that of slavery. And so they turned their attention to the British colony of India. So at that time, Britain was ruling India. The first phase of the Indian indentureship started in 1838, and it was known as the Glaston Experience or Glaston Experiment. It was named like that because John Gladstone, he was the owner of the Glaston estate in British Guyana and now Guyana. He wrote to the British government, asking them to recruit coolies from the Indian subcontinent to labor in the cane fields. So as soon as the permission was given, um, they started to set up main sea depot in Calcutta, and then they also started to have recruiting agents not only in Calcutta but throughout the northern and southern India, set up many sub depots, and these sub depots were run by sub agents called the Arcatias. They are recruiters. And these recruiters or Arcatias, they use many deceitful and callous methods of recruiting laborers. They operated at traditional open fairs, so wherever you have like fairs, what you call mela, near places of worship and other places where people gather together. And they would sometimes give them a lot of sweet talk, but at the same time, they would also kidnap many of the unsuspected villagers and bring them to the depot in Calcutta. Many of the villagers who had never left their villages and had no exposure to the outside world became easy prey to the Arcatias or the recruiters. They were asked both at the main depot when they bring them there if they were leaving India voluntarily or not. And of course, many of the language were in English too. So many of them were also, when they realized that they were forcibly trapped, decided to see if they could have some sort of opportunity to escape. And some of them really did and ran away from the depot. However, there were many of them also who wanted to go overseas to get a well-paid job and also to get a better standard of life and so on. So many of them went willingly. They signed a contract. It was a 5-year contract, but the contract was in English. 5-year contract where you would work for 5 years. You would get a particular salary. There would be conditions. Unlike the slaves, the indentured East Indians would be able to have families. They would be able to build their places of worship. They were free to worship their faith and follow their faith and so on. They would be free to follow their culture and their way of life. They would be free to speak their own languages and so on. Um, After 5 years, then they would be given passage back to India if they so wish, or if they wish to stay, then they would be given 5 acres of land in lieu of the passage that they were supposed to get. Majority of the indentured East Indians, they came from northern side of India, primarily from Uttar Pradesh. There were some who came from Bihar and Orissa, while the others came from Bengal and Chennai, which was Madras at that time. Over 80% of the indentured laborers, they were Hindus. About 15% were Muslims. The Muslims mostly came from northern part of India, Uttar Pradesh, places like Lucknow, Allahabad, Azamgarh, Faizabad, Agra, and other Urdu-speaking areas. Most of the Muslims were Sunni Muslims. But there were also Shia among them too. There were also some Pathans, the Afghans, who from northern western province of Kabul area in Afghanistan. So these Afghans came down to the recruiting areas. Nearest recruiting areas would be in India. And then they also joined the indentureship program too. There were also many Muslims who had participated in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 in India. That was the war against the British for the India's independence. They were defeated and they were brutally suppressed and they were suppressed. So therefore, in order to flee India, they used indentureship as a means of getting away from the suppression and the oppression of the British. In 1890 also, uh, there were some indentured people who were brought from Central and West Java and, and Surabaya in Indonesia, and they were recruited by the Dutch, and they were taken to Suriname. The immigrants, they were aware of their stay in the foreign land, so they knew that their contract would be for a long period of time, that they would be away from their home for a long time. So they brought with them their various seeds from India to grow crops, food. They took with them various utensils along with their various religious books, their various religious beliefs, customs. They took with them their holy book, the Holy Quran. They took with them the Hadith, the book of the Hadith, and they took books written in Urdu and in Persia and so on. They also took with them their folk songs, their folk tales and memories of their villages. So, so they placed all of these choices, belonging, and they put them in a bundle, and they call that bundle Jahazi bundle. And so they came to the Caribbean with this Jahazi bundle from India. The sea voyage from India to the Caribbean took between 3 to 4 months on a sailing ship. And I think later on the steamship, it was shorter. When they started to sail, while crossing what they call Kalapani. Kalapani means dark waters. When they crossed dark waters, the migrants were in constant fear of fire on board the ship, the risk of hurricanes, and the fear of outbreak of contagious illnesses, diseases. The mortality rate was also very high. With many migrants on the ship uh, committing suicide. Everyone slept below deck on the ship, while others were below deck and only had like a light emitting from an oil lamp. And they had to eat whatever was being served, otherwise they would have to starve or fast. So whatever food that they were given, they had to eat the food that was given to them. There were no difference between the Hindus and the Muslims or other religious beliefs during the long journey that they have had. They were traveling for 3 or 4 months, so they built relationship among themselves. Muslims, Hindus, and other castes, people build relationship among themselves. Many of them married on the ship. So you will see Hindu marrying Muslims, maybe Muslim marrying Hindus, and so on. And they started to call each other Jahazi Bhai, the brother of the ship, or Jahazi Vahan, the sister, ship sister, ships, or that would be like brotherhood, Jahazi brotherhood. And they continue even after they landed and went to various plantations. They still maintain and continue that relationship of Jahazi Bhai and Jahazi Behen. When they landed at the various plantations, they were assigned to do various work on the plantation. And the plantation owners were supposed to provide, according to the arrangements or according to the contract that they had signed, certain provisions, certain facilities for these indentured laborers who were coming from India. They were supposed to give them suitable living quarters, but they lapsed in their responsibility. Raymond Chikri and Bibi Kanam, who are Guyanese writers, they said that upon the arrival in the colony, the Indians were housed in commercial quarters, either in lodges or board coolie yard, that once housed the former slave referred to as the nigger yard. So they were treated very similar to how they would have treated the slaves, the African slaves. And the indentured Indians also live in tapia houses, which was made of wood, and from the slavery days in the barrack. So it's a very, very similar living condition, the home, the accommodation, and so on, to that of the slavery days. that the African slave experienced. The partition rooms were never reached to the roof and there was no privacy. Cooking was done on the front steps and water supply was inadequate. There were not enough latrine or sometimes no latrine at all. So the men, women, boys, and girls had to go to the cane fields or bushes whenever the nature called. That's what they had to do. Malaria, hookworm, and other similar diseases were rampant. It was prevalent. Guyanese historian Mr. Patrick Dial said when I interviewed him, he said that when the Indians got sick, they were taken to the same slave hospitals, and the treatment was just for the sick to stay there. Rum was regarded as one of the pharmaceutical things. The rum was supposed to cure malaria and other diseases. There were usually no treatment in the hospital. It was like a prison. When you get sick, you either die in your little hut or you go to the hospital and you die there. So there was no choice. Die in the hut or you die at the hospital. No medicine except they provide you with rum. The indentured laborer was supposed to work for 40 hours per week, but during crop season, it could be 50 hours per week. Most of the work was paid on a task basis. And that was something that was not written in the contract, but that's how they decided to pay them. They were supposed to be paid 30 to 40 cents per task, but they were given only 25 cents per task. And sometimes they were not paid at all. The planters deducted 8 cents a day from the Indians for providing rations of rice, flour, butter, and split peas. The Indians kept livestock, they planted crops, ground provisions, and to supplement their own diet. So they would make extra sales and get some income along the way too, and that would also help them in their livelihood at the same time. The indentured laborers who broke any immigration laws, no matter how insignificant, were prosecuted as criminals and given jail terms. Many of the immigrants were flogged with the cat o' nine tails, and their rebellion over the harsh treatment were subdued by force. After the completion of the 5-year indentureship contract, the immigrants were issued a document, and it was known as the exemption certificate. Many immigrants, including many Muslims, did not choose to return back to India. They decided to stay and get the 5-acre land and start to work the land. Most of them had planted rice and because they went into agriculture and so on. The Muslim labor decided to settle in the new land. They came from villages and towns in India where Islam was prevalent, with its mosques and madrasas. Madrasa would be the school for children to go and learn Arabic and learn how to pray and learn the basic principle of Islam and so on. And other various institutions that they would have come from north of India, Uttar Pradesh and so on. And as I said earlier, Hindus and Muslims would have met at the depot at first. And then on the ship, on the long journey, they would have started to talk about their own home, village, or their own, they would talk about their own family life and so on. And so that relationship developed, as I said earlier, but it continued. So when I landed on the plantation too, because of that Jahaji Bhai and Jahaji Bahan relationship was so strong that it continues. And so when they landed and they started to build their homes and so on, they married each other. They started to help each other building their mosque. They started to help each other building their mandirs. Muslims would help the Hindus build their holy places. The Hindus would help the Muslims to build their holy places and so on. They did this not on the basis of any religion or any faith, because they came to do the same job and they had the same single purpose. They needed each other because both of them came into the hostile and unfamiliar environment. So when you come into a hostile and unfamiliar environment, you cling to those individuals, that you can relate to. After the end of indentureship period, the Hindus and Muslims, they started to reconstruct their family life and their family values. They would intermarry and visit each other. So Hindus would marry, even now on the plantation, Hindus would marry Muslims, Muslims would marry Hindus. They would assist each other in building homes and respective places. They would help each other in even in planting and harvesting. Uh, so they would have a system called do tarfa, do tarfa, do mean two tarfa, do both ways. So you would help me for 5 days to plant or reap the harvest, and then I will help you for 5 days to plant and reap the harvest. But there will be no payment will be involved in doing that. So this was more like a reciprocal arrangement between the two parties. The Muslims, they were poor and simple people with little education, who only learned how to read the Quran, and they knew about the saying of the Prophet and so on. So they knew basic Islam. However, they were also among them, there were learned Muslims who also decided to come to safeguard the faith of those Muslims who did not have much knowledge. And so they would keep Islam alive by teaching these Muslims who did not have much knowledge. These Muslims, they brought along their various religious festivities and religious function with them. They brought along with them Mawlud, Qasida, Durud Sharif, Milad Nabi, that would be the birthday of the Prophet, fasting in the month of Ramadan, celebrating Eid al-Fitr, that is the festival after the end of the month of Ramadan. Another festival called Eid al-Adha, which we just had recently, and Muharram. Muharram is the new year in the Islamic calendar. So from tomorrow, it will be the Islamic New Year, Muharram, 1442. Islamic New Year began from the day the Prophet Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina. And so Muslims start their counting as their New Year, Muharram, from the day the Prophet migrated from Mecca to Medina. And so tomorrow will be the Islamic New Year, and that year will be 1442. And as you know, Muslims go by lunar calendar, not by solar calendar. So today we would be observing the moon, new moon, and after we see the new moon, then from tomorrow, then it will be the month of Muharram. Of course, in the month of Muharram also, you would have heard that there is the Ashura. You hear about the Jose festival and so on, which I will talk about a little bit. So this is what usually happens. So Muslim laborer would also try their best to perform their prayer during their working time, but I do not think that I saw any evidence that any of the Muslim laborers really performed their prayer under the watchful eyes or the overseer of women. They would perform their prayer at home before going to work, 6 o'clock in the morning. They probably would perform it when they come back. They would then have open air mosque, and everybody would get together maybe on the weekend and have a congregational prayer and so on. They would also encourage and pay a special attention to educating their children, called madrasa, like an Islamic school, where they would teach their children, and those learned individuals who would have come as indentured laborers, they would then make sure that, and their role was really to educate those unlearned adults, and also to educate and to teach the little children how to read the Quran and to know the basics, the basic aspect of Islam. These learned people also would travel from village to village on their off days and educate those who don't know much about Islam and so on. The Muslims on their off days, they would get together, they would cook, they would eat, and they would start to tell they would cook various food, dal and rice and roti and gosh, which would be meat, mutton or chicken or beef, and naan. And then they would tell stories, what they call kahani. stories about the village and story about their own life. Uh, and then they would also have what you call Maulud Sharif. Maulud Sharif is like getting together. Uh, Everybody would get together. It's an Islamic function or religious function. Uh, they would have food and so on. There would always be an opportunity or an excuse for having a Maulud. Somebody have a boy, have a birthday of a boy or child, you know, child is born and things like that. So they would have the reading of the Quran. This would be a good opportunity for indentured laborers to get away from the work. They would read the Quran. You would have the scholar among them or the learned one among them would give a little lecture on Islam or whatever the topic that individual would choose. Then they would sing qasidas. Qasidas would be Islamic songs. And then they would sing some songs praising the Prophet and so on. And after that, then they would they'll partake on food, whatever that they would, that somebody, the guest or the host would have come. Uh, they would celebrate the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, which called the Milad Nabi. They would fast in the month of Ramadan. They were very punctual. They were very conscious of their religion. The Muslims were very, very conscious of their religion. So they would do their best under the most severe circumstances to practice their faith. So in the month of Ramadan, they would wake up early and they would go to the nearest open mosque, or if they have a mosque, and pray their morning prayer and then go to work. They walk maybe for a mile or two, and then 6 o'clock they would come back, break their fast, and then they would go to their evening prayers. So most of them were very punctual in fasting. And then at the end of the month of Ramadan, there will be Eid al-Fitr, the festival of fast breaking. They would then all get together. This would be a joyous occasion. They would go and have their morning prayer. They will have what they call savaya. It's a sweet something to eat. They would then visit each other for the Eid, for the festival of Eid. In the festival of Eid al-Adha, that is the festival of sacrifice, where they commemorate Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son. Then they would kill sheep or they would kill cow, and they would distribute the meat among themselves. They would have a cook-up and so on. So they continue to follow all of these festivals and all of the Islamic rituals that they learned when they were in their land, in their homes, in Uttar Pradesh. These actions and this encouragement by the scholars who had come with them to help them to fight decolonizations and the onslaught of the Christian missionaries who were always using devious and dubious methods to convert them. Even when they got married, the marriage was not accepted by the colonial masters. They had the marriage, we would call it marriage de bamboo. So they would get married in the bamboo shed. And they could not register the marriage until you are Christianized. But even despite all of these external forces knocking on their door, they were still able to hold firmly to their way of life and the way how they were brought up in their own culture back home. So unlike the slaves, African Muslims, the East Indian indentured laborers were then allowed to practice their faith, have families, build their places of worship, and so on. Even when they were given permission to build their mosque and so on and to pray, there are many instances where while Muslims were praying, for example, the prayer of Eid in Trinidad, the Muslims, while praying, they were flogged by the colonial masters and their police and so on. when the Shiite Muslims also came along with the other Muslims, and they also observed the day of Ashura. The day of Ashura is the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson, Hassan and Hussein at Karbala in Iraq. Shiite Muslims tend to observe that. You call that, they do the Hosei festivals. And they had a procession in San Fernando in Trinidad. This Jose processions had about 6,000 people. And the colonial police read out an order that they are supposed to cease and do not march any further. But many of these indentured Indian Muslims did not know English. And so they continued. And so the police fired on them. A few dozens were killed, and there were about 6,000 of them, and about over 100 of them were injured. So although you had an arrangement where you can, practice your faith, your religion, your way of life, and yet impediment was always put on them to prevent them from doing so. Muslims were always keen to learn about their faith. So many times what they would also do too is that they would walk for miles and miles, see if they could find someone who will teach them their way of life. How they would teach them how to pray, how to do ablutions before prayer, how to learn some of the verses of the Quran and so on. They were also very keen on getting their children married. And so whenever your child or your son or your daughter get a teenager age, they would then try their best to get that person married. And that was one of the things. They would try to make sure that they do not send their children to schools because they don't want the Christian influence and they don't want their children to become Christians. As I said earlier, that among the indentured laborers, there were also people from Indonesia, Javanese Muslims who came. They came around 1890 and they were brought by the Dutch to Suriname. The Javanese Muslim also practice Islamic culture, customs and tradition, but also of their ancestor cultures. So a little bit about Javanese Muslims. They practice their Islamic culture, but at the same time, they also have their own ancestral customs, Javanese customs. So one of the most prevalent ancestral customs was that 1,000 days after an individual passes away, when someone passes away, there will be an informal gathering called Salametat, where they will read the Quran, give lectures, and make supplication for the deceased person. And then after that, they would have food, they would serve food and so on. But now I think that practice is no longer in action. I don't think people usually practice that ancestral culture anymore. And marriage time, according to this Javanese tradition, the night before the wedding, the bride would take a bath, and then the woman would come and apply turmeric paste all over her body. She would keep that paste on her body for the whole night. And then next morning, they would clean up that paste, and then she would take a bath and so on, and then they would place various ornaments on her. And the bridegroom would then come afterwards. He would be fully decked in flowers and so on. And of course, he would be riding on a horse, and he would have a procession following him. They call it barat. Then the groom would stop a short distance from the bride's party, and the couple would then throw banana leaves folded in petals at each other before the wedding ceremony take place. And this is the customs of the Javanese people. Again, I think that practice has stopped in the late 1970s, so that practice is not prevalent anymore again. And the Javanese Muslims also observe all of the Sunnah, all of the ways, the tradition, and the practices of the Muslims, the Sunnah of the Muharram, but they call it Suradan and Asura. So they also do the Maulud, like the Hindustani Muslims that would do, and so on. What happened when the Javanese Muslims first came from Indonesia to Suriname? they were accustomed building their mosque facing westwards. So when they came to Suriname, they continued building their mosque building westward, not not realizing that they have come full circle. So they are supposed to be building their mosque facing the east, but they continue to be building their mosque facing westwards. Uh, and of course, when they were told uh, that that is incorrect, that the direction of facing the Qibla or facing Kaaba in Arabia, that direction is exactly opposite to where they are accustomed facing in Surin, in Indonesia. Many of them, uh, because they are so uh, embedded in their own custom, refuse to follow to change the direction of the mosque. And so they continue praying in the West, but all of the young ones, younger Muslims and so on, who become more and more learned, then decided that if these older senior people who are not listening, then they decided then that they are going to build their own mosque. So they built it exactly on the opposite direction. Uh, as you know, indentureship ended in 1917. Many of the East Indian Muslims and Indians in general decided to stay in the land, whether it is Trinidad or Guyana or Suriname. Trinidad and Guyana had the majority of the East Indians and thereby East Indian Muslims too. Uh, they stayed, they then moved away from the plantation and they started to develop their own life, raise their own family and so on. But not all East Indians or all East Indian Muslims came out as indentured laborers. So for example, in Barbados, uh, East Indian Muslims came, but they did not come as indentured laborers. We never had East Indian indentureship in Barbados. Barbados was always overpopulated anyway, so we didn't need to have any East Indian coming. Only around 1818, I think, that one of the ships that was going to St. Vincent, it ran aground in Carlisle Bay. And so they had to get another ship and transfer those same East Indian indentured laborers to another ship. I was told that some of the goats ran away. So we probably would have some Indian goats somewhere knocking around in Barbados. But apart from that, there were no indentureship in Barbados. However, East Indians came to Barbados, and it just happened to be the first individual just happened to be a Muslim. His name was Bashar Ali Diwan. He came in 1910, and he came from a Hooghly district in West Bengal. Of course, Muslims had come previously. They had come, they were among the slaves that were brought to Barbados, and there were many, many Muslims among the slaves that were brought throughout the Caribbean. So Bashar Ali Diwan was the first known East Indian Muslim to come to Barbados. So he came on his own. Apparently, he did not set out to come to Barbados. His father-in-law was living in Trinidad. So he decided to go by his father-in-law in Trinidad. And after staying for a few weeks, he decided to come to Barbados. No reason why he really decided to come to Barbados. But when he came to Barbados, then he decided to go into business. He went to the merchants in Swan Street and so on, and he bought merchandise and he went around the countryside and he started to give his merchandise on a credit basis because that was a niche market. Before that, poor people, poor Black people could not go in the Bridgetown and buy whatever item they needed on a credit basis. Firstly, they could not go, they didn't have time to go into Bridgetown or Swan Street or Broad Street to buy stuff because they were working in the plantation. If they could afford to go, they had to pay on a cash basis. So he facilitated them. He would take whatever he had, whether he would take a bus or ride a bicycle, with basic stuff that he would carry. So for those who were working in the cane field, they probably would carry cutlasses and hats and khaki pants, and khaki shirt and material and a jacket and so on. Then later on, he began to call his family, and then he started to call the people from his village. Uh, they would then help each other. They will live in a commune. They will live in market. So about 6 or 7 or 8 of them will live together. They would help each other cooking, and they would go around. Those newcomers, they would uh, help them with the goods. They will introduce them to the merchants in Swazi, whether it is Nichols or whether it is DeCosta or whatever, and they would get a credit for, and then they would go around in their little suitcases, cash in buses, or that they would ride bicycles, and then they would go. They would work for about 6 days, and then the seventh day, they would probably usually be Friday. That is the congregational day of prayer. They would get together, and then they would cook, and they would talk about their villages, Kahani, as we talk about again, how their life is and so on. Many of them were married. Many of the Bengalis were married. But because they could not afford to call their wives, they decided that they will marry the Barbadian woman. Because also being a Muslim, Islam allows Muslims to have more than one wife. So they decided to marry Barbadian women. And when they marry Barbadian women, Islam also allows Muslims to marry the people of the book, which would be the Jews and the Christians. So the women do not have to convert to Islam. So these women, these Bengalis, and even the Gujaratis afterward married, remain in their faith. So they remain Christians. They will continue to practice their Christian beliefs. They will, even the children, when the children are born, they will take their own children to church and so on. And a Muslim, he will continue to practice his faith. There were two things that was a no-no in the house. One was that you cannot have alcohol. You could not have alcohol in the house. And then you could not serve pork in the house. The Muslims, they would work, they would go house to house, they would credit and so on. So, and they build that relationship. And that relationship exists even up to today. And that relationship is even as strong as it was before. These early traders laid the platform, and I think that relationship is still continuing. They were like partners in profit, partners in poverty, because there were many, they weren't rich. And so they were renting homes in Chapman Street and King Street and Lightfoot Lane and Kensington New Road and so on, Fontebelle and so on. So it is only after the independence in 1966, as a lot of the Barbadians improved financially and otherwise. So therefore, the conditions of the East Indian Muslims in Barbados also improved financially and otherwise. When they first came and they started to live together in commune, and whenever they get married, then they will leave that commune, then they will go and rent a house, other places and live with their Barbadian family. So this is the kind of thing that they did. In 1929, the other groups of people came through. So after Bengalis, they were the Gujaratis who came. They were learned people. You see, the Bengali Basha Tali never set out to come to Barbados, but he ended up in Barbados. The same very way, the Gujarati Muslim never thought of coming to Barbados, but they also ended up in Barbados. And so these Muslims never thought of coming to Barbados. They came to Barbados accidentally, but they made their home, their progeny, their children made Barbados their homes. And so today you will find that the Muslim population in Barbados is about 2,500. They mix, even today they marry, there's a mixed marriage between the local Barbadians and the East Indians in Barbados. You have more and more Barbadians. Now the local Barbadians are becoming Muslim, converted to Islam and so on. They send their children to school. They are doctors and lawyers and other secular role that they are playing. But at the same time, they're also educating their children in the Islamic way of life. They are the Islamic school here too. And then there are a lot of the Barbadian Muslims also become Hafiz, who memorize the Quran. So there are about 120 in Barbados who know the Quran by heart, who memorize the Quran. Actually, we export Hufaz, because those who memorize the Quran. Some even went as far as Japan, the time of Ramadan, when you have to see extra prayers. They would have gone all in Japan, they go all over the Caribbean. So we are exporting Islamic scholars to the other parts of the Caribbean. We have about over 50 scholars, male scholars, and then we have about 40 or so lady scholars. And the Muslims in Barbados still consider themselves to be Bajan Muslims, and they consider Barbados to be our home. Maybe I think that is, the end of my second lecture. Has more to do with the East Indians and the arrival of the East Indians and so on. And the situation in Barbados is that the Barbadian Muslims are continue to play their part to become a better and better Barbadian, contributing in every aspect of Barbadian society, because we consider ourselves as Barbadians and we know that we have a special role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabir. Thank you for that very informative presentation. We now open the floor to anyone who wishes to comment, ask a question. Just indicate your desire by using the raise hand feature. And once we have acknowledged you, you can then unmute your microphone and make your submission. Okay, we have Marcia Nurse who wish to acknowledge you. So go ahead and make your submission.
Good afternoon, Harriet. Good afternoon, Sabir, and all those who are watching. Thank you, Sabir, for so much data that gives context to the lives of persons coming here from India and also persons in Africa. I have come to the point in my life where I don't talk about the Middle East anymore because I know it is Africa. I wanted to suggest, I know you have written 2 books and certainly viewers should try to read them, but I also been exposed to this book called Maharani's Misery, Narratives of a Passage from India to the Caribbean by Vereen Shepherd. And this book speaks so much to points you made with regards to the experiences that persons under apprenticeship coming from India to the West Indies would have experienced, and the comparative between what they experienced and the African slave trade. So I just thought I would mention that. And also I found it very interesting, Sabir, that you mentioned the Indonesian, the fact that some of the ships coming would have also carried persons practicing the Muslim religion who would be ethnicity Indian or country of origin India, the continent of India. Because I found that some of the persons I speak to, and even myself, when I had my DNA ancestry, DNA results, that it showed pockets of percentages aligned with my DNA into the Philippines. So you have given some context to that as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Any other comment or question?
Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Venables from Rutgers University in New Jersey. And my family came to Barbados in the 1760s and were very involved in finance. My great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Venables, always had on his written materials, Thomas Venables of London, Barbados, and Philadelphia. And I've been to Barbados 5 or 6 times. My cousin Sarah has a home there. And I was fascinated by the way financing was done. And many times they would use kegs of rum as cash and carry. My family prospered for many years with that trade triangle between London, Barbados, and Philadelphia. And my grandfather's buried at Christ Church in Philadelphia. He actually died before the revolution. And his wife, Rebecca, carried on in his interests and made many trips to Barbados and back. But I was very interested as well in the Indian connection because the Indian families that I've worked with over the years in Punjab and down in Calcutta and so forth, they too followed the money. The merchant class, shall we say, was always involving persons from India, and their culture is a vibrant and very important one for all of us in terms of global economy. But I want to thank the professor for his lecture. I enjoyed it, and I hope to be down again as soon as this pandemic begins to settle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We look forward to your visit to Barbados and to the library here at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. I do know your cousin, Sarah.
Great, okay.
Any other submissions? Okay, it seems as though there are no other questions or comments from the floor. So I want to thank Sabir again for a very interesting presentation. Like Marcia, I was quite struck by the fact that you said persons came from Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yes, and Indonesia. Because we always say indentured, we talk about India, not knowing that there are others coming from other parts. Sabir?
Yeah, actually, the Afghanis are the ones built the first mosque, the mosque called Queenstown Mosque in Georgetown, Guyana. Very, very big, called Juma Mosque. The Afghanis built that mosque in Guyana. And my book, see the mosque here, that was built by the Afghanis, people coming from Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Sabir. Yes. So I encourage all the persons out there to get a hold of a copy of Sabir's book. I think so.
Hello.
Go ahead and speak.
Sabir.
Yes, sir.
Alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
We are poetry.
Hello?
Will there be a
Hello?
poetry? Will there be a poetry?
Oh, will there be a part 3? Marcia will tell you that.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh, yes, there's going to be a part 3. I was going to tell you all about that in my wrap up. So are you finished? Do you want to say anything else to Sabir?
No, he knows me, I know him, and he will know why me.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Before I came to India.
Okay.
Actually, his father, you know, I talk about, remember, I always talk about those who memorize the Quran. His father was the one who also memorized the Quran, and he had one of the most melodious recitations of the Quran in Barbados, especially in the 50s and the 60s. So his father, I know him very well. I prayed behind him, and when he's reciting the Holy Quran, you just don't want him to stop reciting the Quran. That is how beautiful his voice was.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So yes, Sabir, thanks again for a very interesting presentation. And the third installment of this will be in November. I will advise you as to the particular date. So Sabir, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, look forward to part 3 in November. But before that presentation in November, we will have Sir Paul Altman, who will be coming in September to speak about the Jewish connection. That presentation should be the 17th of September. But again, I will send out the necessary information. So that is Sir Paul Altman, September, the history of the Jews in Barbados, and Sabir in November, part 3 of the Muslims of CARICOM. So thank you all so much for being with us today. And I look forward to seeing you again in next month in September. Thank you and be safe. Bye.